This is Value Investing. I'm your host, Jun Kim. In this podcast, you'll learn everything related to value investing. Hello, fellow investors. Welcome to another episode of Value Investing. This is episode 41. And I hope that everyone is enjoying the last week of 2018. And as of recording right now, I'm doing recording in advance, so it's still in the middle of 2018 December. But hope that everyone is just doing everything fine for the last week of 2018. And this is going to be broadcast on that week. What I decided to do this episode is a little bit different from the previous ones because I decided to introduce myself and talk about me and also about this podcast because this is probably going to be a great opportunity for me to just make myself known to the people listening to my podcast in terms of who I am, what I do, and also why I started this podcast and so on. I've been asked from different means like emails about who I am and why I do this, but I just didn't really have time to respond to those emails because of other priorities in my life. So I'm going to just try to address all the details about me and this podcast. So hopefully this is going to be an interesting episode. So let me just give you a little bit of background of myself. I'm a director on the enterprise risk management team at American Express. And I've been in this financial risk management field for about 8 years, and I'm currently working in New York. You might ask me why I started this podcast. So let me just try to address that question first. I want to tell you that I'm passionate about value investing, and I've been following Warren Buffett, Peter Lynch, all these legendary value investors for a very, very long time, more than 10 years. So I got interested in value investing when I was in high school, I think around that time. And I thought to myself, like, what is the best way for me to, or quickest way for me to make money in this day and age? And I came to realization that if I try to make money using my own labor, then I'm not going to be able to make that much money. But if I become a good investor, then I can make money, tons of money over time because of compounding effect. And I started my investing journey by doing some technical analysis using or looking at the charts of various stocks. And I quickly realized that that's not the way to go. And I got to know Warren Buffett quickly because he was very famous back then. And I wanted to know everything about Warren Buffett. And that's how I got interested in value investing. When I was in college, I was keen on studying more about value investing and anything related to finance. So I got my master's degree in finance back then, even though I had a bachelor degree in computer science. And I also pursued CFA, and now I'm CFA charter holder. So why did I start this podcast? So as I mentioned, I'm passionate about investing and value investing, and I just wanted to share my thoughts and views on value investing with other people, and also go a little bit deeper on various topics with respect to value investing. And when I was searching for podcasts as it relates to value investing, I couldn't really find one that actually going in depth with respect to value investing. So I decided to just start my own podcast because I couldn't find anything like that. So that's how I started my podcast. And another really good data point that I had back then was when I first started podcast in March 2018. When I watch annual meetings for Berkshire Hathaway, I was quite surprised by the fact that there are tens of thousands of people flocking to Omaha just to see Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. So I thought to myself, this is a great audience. I can really address a lot of details with respect to value investing. So I started my podcast assuming that there will be a huge demand, as you can see from the number of people attending annual meetings for Berkshire Hathaway. that's kind of the reason why I started this podcast. And I just want to make sure that everyone knows that you're probably not going to make money if you want to start your own podcast. So I want to just say this one up front, because financially, it is not easy to monetize your podcast based on my experience. So let's just talk about money and see if it makes sense if you're interested in doing podcasts on whatever fields that you're interested in. There are definitely a lot of podcasters who are making a good amount of money from doing podcasts. But what I can tell you is that if you just purely do this for the money, then you're not going to get so far. For example, I have two different sources of money coming into my pocket from running this podcast. The first one is through donations. So I included a link for every episode so that people who is willing to donate can donate, and I can monetize podcasts in that way. But as far as donations are concerned, it's very small amount. So far, I've been doing podcasts for more than 6 or 8 months, but I only got about, less than $20 in total from donations. So people don't usually donate, so you're not going to make money from that source that much. The other one is affiliate marketing. I was covering a lot of books related to value investing, so I always make sure that I include the link in case someone wants to buy the book from Amazon. For example, recently I covered a book called Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits by Philip Fisher, and that's the main topic that I cover for the last, 5 episodes. And I included the link in case someone wants to buy, but people don't buy the books from the link. So if you guys buy a book, it's going to be helpful for me because I get, 5% or 8% cut. But in terms of the book price, it's already very cheap, maybe $10 and less than $15. So it's not a really big amount of money that you get. So what I want to emphasize here is in total, I probably have gotten less than, $50 in total, whereas I spent tons of time doing research and recording, editing this podcast. So given the amount of time that I spend here, if you just purely are for your financial gains, when you're starting your podcast, you're not going to go that far because you're going to give up because, you quickly realize that this is not going to bring any money. In the future, I'm also thinking about getting some sponsorship from corporations, if possible, if they're selling the products that are relevant for our listeners. But usually I need to get more than 10,000 downloads per episode, and that's a long way to go. So I still don't have any plans for getting any corporate sponsorship. So that's about my podcast and its finance. So then now the question is, why do I actually do this podcast if I don't get any financial benefits, right? So that's the first question that you might ask, because for each episode, I spend at least 4 to 5 hours per episode because first I have to do a lot of research on the subject and I have to summarize them and do the recording and do the editing. And I have to upload this audio file to the platform. And also at the same time, I have to pay a small amount of fee to the hosting platform every month. So actually I'm negative in terms of cash flow. So the question is, why do I do this podcast and why I'm passionate about value investing? There are some intangible benefits that I'm getting from doing this podcast. First, it forces me to refresh my memory on the topics as it pertains to value investing. So that was a huge benefit for me because as a value investor, what you have to do is you have to stick with your strategy and principles. And it's not easy to do that unless you remind yourself constantly, consistently over time, because you tend to forget what Warren Buffett does, what Peter Lynch does. But if you force yourself to repeat the principles over and over again, you kind of build up that mental muscles and discipline that you can use for your portfolio management. So that was a big benefit that I got from doing this podcast. The second benefit is communication skills because I already have 9-to-5 jobs. So I'm already occupied with a lot of things that I have to do for that job. And One of the things that I have to improve is communication skills. And if I do podcasts, I thought to myself that this is probably the best way to improve my communication skills. And I can easily use this skill set for my corporate job. So that was also a huge intangible benefit that I got from running this podcast. One other thing related to me is that this is probably potential tool that I can use for marketing myself in the future. I don't know exactly where I'm going to end up and what kind of things I'm going to do in the future, but potentially might be one of the marketing tools that I can use to brand myself, and this is a good way, potential benefit that I might get in the future. Lastly, this is the most important one. I might have the potential to be connected to like-minded people. And now, still the community is small, but I think that as the podcast grows, I should be able to meet and talk to people who have similar mindsets as I do. So that's going to be a big thing that I have in my mind. So why don't we talk about this podcast a little bit more, and I just want to give you a couple of stats that I want you to contemplate a little bit. This podcast has about 1,000 downloads per episode. So I consider this 1,000 downloads as people, actual number of people. So if I go somewhere and try to give lecture, how can I have the lecture with 1,000 people? I'm not going to have that opportunity often. So through this podcast, I was able to attract a lot of people, a lot of like-minded people who are interested in value investing. So this is a great platform for me to express my views as it relates to portfolio investing and express my learning from all these different legendary value investors. And hopefully I'm adding a lot of value to you guys listening to this podcast. I'm so happy about the achievement that I have, and throughout 8 months of operation, I was able to accumulate this number of people listening to my podcast. So I feel very appreciative of you and share your opinions frequently with me through either emails or through comments from different podcast platforms. Okay, now let's talk about the direction this podcast is supposed to head to. Because there are just many different directions that I can think about and many different strategies I can implement for this podcast. I've been thinking very hard about how I can add value to my listeners. So far, the current format of this podcast is to do some research. I do some research on various books related to value investors like Warren Buffett, Peter Lynch, Joel Greenblatt. And I just lay out the details and go a little bit deeper and just try to understand what their strategies are and how they make money and how I can add value and how these things are applicable for you guys. I'm going to continue to do that. Definitely, that's one of the great formats that I found to be useful, and that's going to be very helpful from my perspective for a lot of people. So I'm going to keep that format. But also what I'm thinking about is I may just do some interviews with people who are well-known value investors out there, and that's going to require some significant amount of my time. If I feel that that's going to add value, then I'm definitely willing to do that for the sake of improving quality of the podcast and also listen to the people in person, how they actually implement value investing strategies in the industry. That's going to be exciting opportunity. I haven't actually scheduled any interviews yet, but that might be something that I can contemplate a little bit and put it into action in the future. Another format that I'm also thinking about is covering individual stocks in the US and Korea. So there are just a lot of stocks covered by these big media companies, CNBC and so on. So they usually cover large cap stocks or middle cap stocks. So what I can do is I can just go over certain stocks that are maybe small cap or that are not easily covered by these big media companies, and I can try to add value. Also, one thing that I can do is, since I'm quite familiar with Korean market, I can talk more about Korean market in general and individual stocks in that market, because I honestly feel that there are a lot of great companies in Korean market right now that are selling at very, very cheap multiples. And US investors are not aware of the fact that there are a lot of good stocks internationally. And they don't really go out and venture out and try to invest their money in foreign market. Understandably, there are a lot of risks involved because you might not be familiar with these stocks, and if that's the case, then you shouldn't invest. And second, there's foreign currency exchange rate risk, which means your exchange rate might go against you over the long term. And that's a big concern for a lot of investors. So given the limitations and restrictions that a lot of US investors have, they may not really be keen on investing in foreign stocks. But what I can tell you is that if you're willing to venture out, there are just a lot of opportunities out there. And I can provide my point of views on a lot of different Korean stocks and see whether it makes sense to include in your portfolio. You might have some limitations in terms of opening your brokerage account in Korea or buying Korean individual stocks, but let's see how it goes. Hopefully, we can address those issues as well. Lastly, the most common thing that CNBC, these big media companies do is covering current events taking place in the market. I think that's something that I can probably think about whether it makes sense to do it here. But if it provides good entertaining value, then maybe I can talk about it and maybe try to invite someone onto the show and talk more in detail with respect to the current matters happening in the market. For example, I thought very fascinating about the tweets by Elon Musk, and he's a very fascinating character to cover. So it's something to just enjoy and just be entertained. I think that's primary purpose of this podcast, as well as adding value to your portfolio management. So those are the formats that I could potentially cover. I don't think that I'm going to go into one format or the other quickly, but I'm going to continue to maintain the current format, which is based on the books that I read as it relates to a lot of value investors. But in the future, I may incorporate a different variety just to give different flavor and color to you guys and, add value. That's what's most important thing. So that's kind of my vision for 2019 podcast, value investing podcast. And also I'm in the process of creating new website and still under construction, and it's going to take a while. The whole thing takes a while, and I want to get it implemented as soon as possible, but I'm the only one person in charge of this podcast. I don't have any other human capital, so to speak, to manage this podcast. So everything has to be done by me. So that's why it takes some time. Also, I have my 9-to-5 job, which I have to dedicate my time and energy to. So there are just some limitations that I have. So hopefully you guys understand what I'm trying to do. But I'll try my best at least to post one episode a week just to make sure that I keep on track of doing what I'm supposed to do for you guys, because I want to keep the promise that I made and hopefully adding a lot of value along the way. Okay, so that's it for this episode. I hope that you guys had an opportunity to understand who I am and what this podcast is about and what kind of directions and strategic direction I chose to do for 2019. And I hope that you guys enjoyed the last week of 2018, and Happy New Year, and see you next time.